We've been into RGB video for classic consoles for over a decade now, but one highly desired theoretical mod, a holy grail mod for one of the most popular and most timeless consoles of all time, has long remained unattainable. Until now. This capture is not from a one-chip Super Nintendo or an RGB modded Junior console. No, this recording is from a very early Super Famicom, but without the characteristic blur that you'd expect. So what is this new mod, and how does it compare against unmodified consoles, one-chips, and modded one-chips across a variety of upscaler hardware and CRTs? Let's find out. Several years ago, MLiG supporter The Importer was doing a bit of collection culling and said that they'd like us to have a boxed Super Famicom that we could use on the show. Flash forward to more recent times, and Voltar tells us that he's got a mod in the works that will finally get rid of the blur that plagues the vast majority of Super Nintendo consoles, and he'd like to install one for us to check out. Now, there is documentation online showing how people have attempted this sort of thing before, but there have generally been downsides and limitations, as seen in this footage from Retro RGB. To be honest, I didn't know about these until Bob showed me these clips. But it would seem that Voltar's mod is the first designed to be fairly easy to install and work with any board revision of SNES console released before the one-chips. Now, I've got 4 usable Super Nintendo systems. First, my childhood system from 1994, whose sticker by the power button is starting to fail, but dang it, it's made it this far, I just can't bring myself to peel it off. Then, an RGB modded Junior console that's been my primary SNES console throughout most of the years of my life in gaming, an unmodified one-chip, and the Super Famicom from The Importer. And I could not have made this episode without using all 4. I thought it would be nice to keep my original personal system unmodified, so I sent Voltar the Super Famicom, which turned out to be quite lucky for reasons I'll get into shortly. But first, let's quickly refresh our memories on what the status of Super Nintendo video output has been up to now so that we're all on the same page. Even though the ability to use RGB video on consumer televisions pretty much didn't exist in regions like North America back in the day, all Super Nintendo consoles sold worldwide nonetheless have native support for 15 kHz RGB video output, up until the smaller SNES 101 model, commonly referred to as the Junior, which only outputs composite video. However, among the major home consoles that shipped with RGB video, the Super Nintendo outputs the softest image of them all. This is caused by an issue in the SNES's second PPU, which isn't capable of transitioning from color to color very quickly as it generates the analog signal, resulting in streaks as the picture is drawn from left to right. But then, at some point around 1995, Nintendo started shipping the one-chip SNES systems. From a business standpoint, this was simply a cost reduction and the hardware was not marketed to consumers as being any different. But internally, the CPU and dual PPU setup from prior systems was combined into a single chip called SCPUN, hence one chip. The most famous characteristic of these systems though, at least to those in the know, is that the video output is much sharper. This made them highly desirable in the decades that followed, but they do have a few notable flaws. Firstly, colors are much brighter compared to earlier systems, which is no doubt eye-catching at a glance, but the fact of the matter is, the gain is just turned up way too much, and it's technically incorrect. As seen here, this problem can mostly be compensated for with various optimization or attenuation methods like the RetroTINK 4K's auto gain setting or the brightness switch on HD Retrovision cables, but it would be better if the levels were just correct to begin with, as it's a hassle and you might not be able to adjust without loss of detail in every scenario. But the one chip flaw that annoys me the most personally are these subtle ghostly patterns that repeat toward the right, most visibly caused by objects with dark outlines next to flatter shades, and it's really obvious next to moving objects. Let me throw the contrast out of whack here so that it's easier for you to see over YouTube. This can only be fixed by replacing the capacitor marked C11 on the motherboard with a better quality, higher value part, which we detailed in a previous video on one-chip mods if you're up to fixing it yourself. However, if you don't capture video and play exclusively on a CRT, even on a higher-end model like a PVM-20L5, or if you use CRT mask effects through an upscaler, then the ghosting issue is, well, masked. And you may not need to worry about it. In addition, one-chip systems have a few bugs, which mostly manifest as minor visual issues at the very top of the screen, most famously in several Capcom games, and one or two or so known issues that are more severe, like crashing in Super Turrican. Some people argue that even though it's an official SNES, the low-level operations of the one chip are different enough from earlier systems that it could be considered a clone console. But in practical application, there's no outwardly discernible difference in game behavior in the vast majority of software. The SNES 101 Junior consoles released in 1997 are also one-chip systems in a different form factor. These need an RGB mod to output anything other than composite video, and we featured Voltar's version of that THS-7374 mod board in that same episode as the capacitor fix about 6 years ago, which gives you the benefits of one-chip sharpness while also bringing the video levels back down to a more accurate level. And this mod can also, of course, be used on the larger one-chip consoles. So if you combine that with the capacitor fix to address ghosting, then you've got the makings of a signal that can produce as pristine an SNES video image as you could ever hope to get with analog video. But all this goes to show that even though all SNES consoles except the Junior have native RGB output, none produce an ideal image without modification. And those mods are only for one-chip systems. So that's why, after making videos about classic console video quality for nearly 10 years now, it is so exciting to finally be able to test and demonstrate Voltar's SNES Edge Enhancer and SNES 2-chip bypass mods, which can be used on any Super Famicom and Super Nintendo console, NTSC, or PAL that was released before the one-chip era. Which brings us back to the Super Famicom from the importer. This turned out to be a unit from the Japanese launch period, but as cool as that may be, it's not necessarily a desirable model. The earliest systems may not end up being as long-lived, and crucially for this application, they are rather noisy on the video output. It's pretty much the worst case scenario, and because of that, it was actually the perfect candidate for Voltar to perform some heavy testing on it so that he could refine that last 1% to 2% to make these mods as good as they could be for all applicable systems. So to the importer who sent me that system, if you're still watching our show, I want you to know that your Super Famicom had a destiny beyond what you might have imagined, a brave volunteer that has aided in the betterment of Super Nintendo kind. So what we're demonstrating is effectively two mods that should ideally be used together. These mods are not for one-chip consoles and can only be used in the earlier, more commonly available systems. These are often nicknamed 2-chip or 3-chip by the community because they use 2 PPUs, but also a discrete CPU. The 1-chip combines 3 chips into 1, which means other consoles have 2 more chips than a 1-chip. So it's 2 chips or 3 chips depending on how you count, or if you're focused on just the 2 PPUs, or the 2 PPUs and the CPU. sometimes people are confused and think that there are 2-chip consoles and 3-chip consoles. And they're like, well, which one do I have? Does a 3-chip have the same problems as a 2-chip? And these questions are founded on a misunderstanding. 2-chip and 3-chip are just different terms for the same thing. All pre-1-chip consoles have blurry video output and are compatible with these mods regardless of board revision. I tend to just sidestep the debate by calling them non-1-chip, but for the sake of clarity and since it aligns with the SNES RGB 2-chip bypass name that Voltar uses for one of the mod components, I'm going to refer to these systems as 2-chip consoles through the remainder of this video. So I'm sorry if that's not the favored nomenclature for anyone watching. You know who you are, but that's just what we're doing. Now, just remember, 1-chips are the late consoles, including the juniors, and everything that came before is what we're terming in this video as 2-chips, which these mods are compatible with. So then, what do these mods do? The SNES Edge Enhancer combines with an interposer that you'll choose based on your system's board revision to, as Voltar has described it to me, to turbocharge the second PPU. This makes it so that the transition between colors is sped up, thus clearing up the long rightward streaks. However, if not for the additional RGB bypass mod, the Edge Enhancer by itself would be accentuating jail bars and lots of other nasties in the analog video signal. In other words, even though they're technically separate mods, installing only the Edge Enhancer is exceedingly inadvisable. So the SNES 2-chip RGB bypass mod is exactly that. It bypasses the system's native RGB encoder for cleaner analog video, in a similar way to RGB mods for 1-chip systems or bypass boards for other consoles like Sega Genesis, which clear up jail bars and the like. It's important to point out, though, that this RGB bypass results in only RGB video being output from the console. Voltar tells me that a future version could possibly add composite and S-video back into the mix, but for now at least, you'll need to be able to use RGB cables or the HD Retrovision cables, which convert RGB to YPBPR component video. Alright, so we know that the 2-chip consoles are really blurry, and that 1-chip consoles, especially modded 1-chips, are really crisp and clean. This difference can be seen on upscalers and CRTs alike. When combined with RGB video output and the best gaming scalers, 1-chip consoles can be truly stunning to behold. So if we're starting from the left picture, how close to this idealized high bar set by the modded 1-chip on the right can the 2-chip mods get us? To be able to best show off scenarios where the 2-chip mods shine, or where they are equal to 1-chip mods, or where the 1-chips may still have a minuscule advantage, I want to talk about something that we've avoided looking at too closely in the past, and that's sampling. If you think about a vinyl record, it contains music of a certain length, but that length is not defined in bits and bytes, although you could take samples from that continuous stream of audio at a rapid rate, convert it into discrete bits, and put it into a digital format like a CD or audio file. In a similar way, a line of analog video is a certain length, but to convert that into digital, we need to sample the information along the line at a certain rate. Now, you could use a generic sampling rate that would provide generally acceptable results for any signal that's at, say, a 4:3 aspect ratio. But since video games have a clearly defined horizontal resolution, 256 in the case of most Super Nintendo games, you could also use an optimized sampling rate that's designed to sample exactly the right points in the signal to reconstruct that 256 pixel wide source in the digital realm. That's how you can get razor-sharp pixel edges on advanced upscalers, as can be done quite easily with a 1-chip system. It might sound scary, but you generally don't have to actually figure out the sample rate for yourself, as most of the scalers nowadays have features and profiles that do the heavy lifting for you. Earthbound is a good illustration because of how flat the shading is. If we zoom way in, you can of course see the unmodified 2-chip's signature streaks that run toward the right, which is going to make optimized sampling impossible to achieve. If we switch over to the ultra clean modified 1-chip, you'll notice that it transitions from color to color much more successfully, which bodes well for optimized sampling. Under the best circumstances, it can come shockingly close to something that darn near looks like an HDMI mod. Flipping back over to the unmodified 2-chip then, you can see how the smears influencing every color as you move toward the right give you samples that result in something, more like this. It's my opinion that a system like this should simply never be used with optimized sampling because enshrining those streaks into discrete pixels just seems wrong. It occurs to me that I should also explain what the sampling phase is. This is super not technical, and it probably wouldn't be worth explaining technically even if I could, but the phase is like, you've already narrowed down the sampling rate, the distance from pixel to pixel, but are you sampling from like the center of the pixel, or maybe a bit toward the left or toward the right? On the modded 1-chip, you'll notice that the borders between colors, while fairly tight, are still a bit gradual, invading the next pixel's space. So the phase adjusts this alignment so that for optimized sampling, the points most representative of the source's intended colors are sampled for redrawing the area as a sharp-edged pixel. Some devices help you do this automatically, but as you'll see later, you may need to eyeball it and manually set and save the phase that gives you the cleanest results in your setup on your upscaler. But with that previous example, the unmodified 2-chip, it doesn't matter what the phase is because the pixel to the right is always entirely discolored by the pixel to the left and continues to influence pixels still further to the right. Which brings us to the 2-chip modified with the RGB bypass and edge enhancer. But of course, as sharp as those edges are, they are not perfect. And if we switch back to the modded 1-chip, I'm gonna be honest with you, the 1-chip is still cleaner even though it's not by much. Regardless, the prominent streaking is almost completely resolved, meaning when we perform optimized sampling, we get this. Now let's go back and forth between optimized on the modded 2-chip and optimized on the modded 1-chip. It's really hard to spot any visually perceptible sampling errors, but if you know where to look, they are there. The most obvious error is a slightly pinker pixel just to the right of Paula's mouth. It's actually there on the 1-chip too, but it's almost impossible to see. And it's only possible to see it at all due to the flat shading. The typical SNES game has much more texture and detail than Earthbound, which means that, in general, especially when not zooming in to a ridiculous degree, modded 2-chip consoles can in theory be sampled with virtually the same perceptible quality and precision as 1-chip consoles. Is looking at a game this close totally silly? Under normal circumstances, of course it is. I'm just trying to do my job here, you know? Would minimally discolored samples that are rarely visible stop me personally from using this mod? Not at all. But I just want it to be clear to people that while the improvement in clarity is dramatic with these 2-chip mods, 1-chips are still just that teensy tiniest bit clearer. I want to be on record here to emphasize that I don't believe in the idea that optimized sampling is the be-all end-all. During gameplay at a normal viewing distance, most people would never stop to think that generic sampling isn't sharp enough, especially with 4K upscaling. I mean, guess what? Analog video is wonky, even RGB video, that's just how it is. And sometimes the way games switch video modes or something else in the signal could cause undesirable behavior or artifacts that disagree with optimized sampling. This isn't specific to this new mod or to SNES or to any one upscaler. Concerns like this have had us largely opting for generic sampling up until recently, since we have been dabbling with optimized sampling more often and enjoying it with the RetroTINK 4K. But that's not to say it's 100% perfect even there, so expectations should be realistic. Again, remember, this is really good analog video, but it's still analog video. A lot of this probably should have been a totally separate video topic to begin with, but I guess my point is that you shouldn't feel pressure to use optimized sampling on your device just because you feel like you should, or because everyone else thinks it's the best. I do agree that optimized sampling is usually the best result for this mod if you're cool with being hands-on with profile management, but if all of these minor quirks and caveats I'm pointing out are stressing you out, then know that using a basic generic sampling profile on something like the OSSC, RetroTINK 5X, or RetroTINK 4K is safe and error-free. It's never the wrong profile, and it can be liberating to not have to change profiles from console to console. And especially if you're upscaling with CRT effects, then you don't even need to be thinking about optimized sampling. You still reap a ton of benefits and clarity with generic sampling on a gaming-focused upscaler with RGB compared to other ways to capture or connect these systems to a modern display. And most certainly in this case in particular, the benefits of a modded 2-chip over an unmodified 2-chip are plain as day, even with generic sampling and even with lower output resolutions, as you'll see later. Voltar has demonstrated that getting to this point is a balancing act. Boost the PPU too much and you'll get artifacts from over-sharpening. That is not what you want to see, so the results settled on in the final mod here seem to hit the sweet spot for what's possible with this hardware. So you just have to decide what's more important to you. Is the absolute cleanest and sharpest possible RGB video your top priority? Well, then get a 1-chip and do the appropriate RGB bypass mod and C11 capacitor upgrade. Or would you prefer to use one of the more commonly available models of Super Nintendo that technically have more accurate hardware behavior and you'd settle for a nearly as good RGB signal? Well, then you're exactly the person that this mod is for. If you're feeling the urge to type, "Does this guy not know that emulation exists?" or "Just get a mister," or "These games shouldn't be displayed with sharp pixels, you know," then it's probably not for you. I think there's merit to all of those things just as much as there's merit to these new mods. But even if it does nothing for you personally, it's a pretty big deal for original hardware enthusiasts, and it opens up the accessibility of high-fidelity Super Nintendo RGB gaming to so many more of them than was previously possible. So, I want to spend the rest of this video giving you an idea of what kind of difference in quality you can expect if you integrate a modded 2-chip SNES into your RGB or component video setup, so that you can judge if it's all worth it to you. Most capture in this episode so far has come from the RetroTINK 4K because that's the new hotness, but that hardly represents what everyone's got. So let's take a look at the modded console on a variety of hardware, from upscalers to CRTs, starting with the upscaler that started it all for us. Sorry that we don't talk about the good old XRGB Mini Framemeister that much these days, but even if it's not our go-to anymore, it's every bit as good at 1080p output with those Firebrand X profiles as it always was. Compared against an unmodified console, the boost from the 2-chip mods is pretty apparent, I think, as should be expected since 1-chips always looked great on Framemeister too. Sure, you've got that trademark Framemeister noise that appears in large areas of solid color that we never really understood the cause of, but aside from that, I think if you hadn't looked at a Framemeister in a long time, you might be thinking, dang, it holds up better than I thought it might. Even though there are, of course, much newer alternatives with more modern features, if you still use a Framemeister and are happy with it, then new mods like this can still benefit you. The open source scan converter was our introduction to the idea of optimized sampling, but frankly, it's pretty challenging to dial it in, so we've always tended to use it with generic sampling as seen here. But you know, I actually always liked how using the OSSC in that way made it so simple. Just turn it on and play. But oh, alright, I did my best to get optimized sampling settings working for you. I adapted this from some old Firebrand X notes on 256 pixel wide sampling, but I can't promise that it's perfect, and the phase setting will vary from setup to setup. Regardless, seeing the OSSC display SNES games in a way that I rarely bothered to make the effort for when the OSSC was at the core of my setup is pretty eye-opening. You might still spot some sampling anomalies if you pixel peep too hard, but the OSSC is every bit as impressive as it always was. If the OSSC is still working great in your setup, then I think you'll be really happy with what sharper SNES video output looks like. We don't have an OSSC Pro to test with, but we are curious. The simplified optimized sampling and auto phase detection features should make it much easier to get results like these, or hopefully even better. Even though the OSSC and RetroTINK 2X Pro are at a similar price point, I think the RetroTINK 2X devices are still very important because I find that people can be more receptive to the idea of trying an upscaler that lets them use composite video cables that they already own. Although in this case, of course, we're only able to test the component input via HD Retrovision cables. You might think that being limited to line-doubled 480p output would mean that the modded SNES's clarity boost wouldn't amount to much on the RetroTINK 2X, but I was totally surprised by this. I'll admit that the softer-looking grass on the unmodified console looks more inviting to walk in barefoot, although I'm not convinced the effect is entirely intentional. I don't know what it is though, but something about this humble 480p upscale somehow makes the gulf in sharpness all the wider to my eyes. In addition, when you get this far down the upscale resolution and sampling precision tiers, it becomes pretty silly to split hairs over whether there's any meaningful difference between a modded 2-chip and a modded 1-chip from a clarity perspective. Although, if you're the sort whose favorite thing about the RetroTINK 2X is its optional smoothing filter, then the unmodified console's smearing is probably working in favor of getting the look that you're going for, so the mod might not be of much benefit to you. I have to imagine that there are quite a lot of RetroTINK 5X units out there by this point, and given the cost of upgrading to a scaler that can both input analog video and output at 4K, I think the 5X will continue to be a workhorse in the retro gaming community for a long time, which is why it's important for this mod to look good on it, whether you're outputting at 1080p or 1440p. Like the OSSC, I've generally trended toward using generic sampling on the RetroTINK 5X just because it gets you to the game faster and also minimizes the risk of configuration or sampling errors when I'm recording footage. I mean, heck, I think that generic sampling looks plenty sharp and good enough in most situations. But no doubt due to the ease of using optimized sampling on the RetroTINK 5X, it's a very popular feature and looks great here, although again, you can see some stray off-color samples to the right of certain darker colors if you look in the right places. However, remember when I said that you might have to do some manual phase adjustments? Well, I noticed that the RetroTINK 5X was not locking onto the exact optimal phase for this mod when using automatic phase detection, and in my setup, setting manually to phase 1 gave me the least visible sampling issues. But your phase may be different depending on if you're running through a switcher and stuff like that, so just eyeball it. Super Mario World is one of those easy games to spot issues in due to its flat shading and dark outlines on many objects. So in this example, even though generic sampling for the modded 2-chip and modded 1-chip look pretty darn close, I've manually set and saved the cleanest possible phase for the modded 2-chip. And even then, a faint bit of discoloration remains if you look way too closely at the left edges of the dark green and dark brown areas. The 1-chip, on the other hand, has no discernible issues even when using autophase. I'm not nitpicking because I think this is a serious problem, by the way, but I'm just trying to set expectations because maybe someone out there can't accept this. Again, if you absolutely cannot compromise on having the cleanest possible SNES image from official hardware, and if you must use optimized sampling on the RetroTINK 5X, then you still need to go the modded one-chip route. But if you use generic sampling, or if none of what I just said made any sense, then don't worry about it. The difference is absolutely not perceptible with the typical sorts of graphics that you'd see on SNES, and especially not when you're actually playing and not overthinking things. Then of course, we've got the brand spanking new RetroTINK 4K. Here, we've got the power of Firebrand X and wobbling pixels, absolutely phenomenal profiles that are included on the SD card, in addition to increased granular phase control made possible by the sub-phase setting. Similar to the RetroTINK 5X though, auto phase doesn't work completely perfectly for the modded 2-chip. So to further minimize sampling artifacts, I set my phase manually, as you may be able to see inside the empty heart here. I was able to get it even better than on the 5X, but the best I could do is still just a bit less perfect than autophase on the modded 1-chip. But honestly, you'd probably struggle to see the difference in a majority of games. I really had to think about what kinds of scenarios might show sampling discoloration, which is just barely visible in the few I could find. Even a game with relatively simple graphics like Dragon Quest V still has enough texture to get away with using autophase settings if you're feeling lazy. And I certainly don't think that the results with a minor manual tweak could be distinguished from a modded 1-chip unless you were looking for it with your nose way too close to the screen, just like this NPC who won't get his nose out of my face and out of my shot. So yeah, just like with optimized sampling on the OSSC and RetroTINK 5X, the end result is going to be like 99% indistinguishable from modded 2-chip and modded 1-chip consoles in nearly all games on the RetroTINK 4K. It's just that you may need to make a quick one-time phase adjustment to your profile and resave it for the best results. Or maybe 2 times if you can try it out with any games that use the 512 pixel wide mode. Before we take a brief look at some actual CRT comparisons, let's see if there's any benefit to using the new 2-chip mods if you're using CRT effects on the RetroTINK 4K. Well, using matched PVM style settings, the truth is that the unmodified consoles do look extremely presentable in this context, as the softness doesn't come across so much as the smear or discolored sampling pixels that we see it as in sharp upscaling scenarios. The boost to sharpness with the mod is noticeable, but whether it is even a benefit will be more a matter of personal taste here. You could, of course, intentionally smudge things up even more with something like these consumer-style settings I've concocted here, but admittedly, if we're doing this to a modded console, then we've kind of lost the plot as to why we even got it in the first place, even if the results do look cool. One thing I've noticed though, the sharper source signal almost always has an advantage in making fonts bolder and easier on the eyes, regardless of whether you're going for sharp pixels or the heaviest CRT effects. So that's something to think about if you play a lot of text and number heavy games. One last upscaler that I want to look at briefly is the GBS-Control, an open source community project that uses the cheap and commonly available GBS-8200 video converter board as its basis. I think the most compelling use for it is to output 240p or 480i games in a format compatible with CRT computer monitors over VGA, but the results will obviously vary a ton depending on the monitor. While the line-doubled 480p output mode doesn't result in a look that's authentic to scanline behavior on a 15 kHz CRT, I honestly just love how it looks anyway. I do think that the sharper image is better suited to this application, but the unmodified console's flaws aren't quite as damaging here as they are in digital upscaling environments. Artificial scan lines for 240p games on the GBS-Control work pretty nicely at resolutions like 960p to the point that it can make a VGA CRT a compelling PVM alternative. I'd say that the modded system is doing slightly better here. It retains more detail while still having the soft phosphorus glow of a CRT because, well, it is a CRT. Speaking of PVMs, well, I've always felt that the difference between an older SNES and a one-chip SNES was pretty obvious on a PVM. And it is, but that doesn't mean that an unmodified two-chip console looks ugly on a PVM by any means. And in a pure analog scenario like this, the modded two-chip is every bit as crisp and clean as a modded one-chip. This PVM is a 20L5, which has a very high line count, meaning it can resolve a lot of detail across the horizontal axis, which is of course where the unmodified two-chips struggle. So then what about a more common sort of mid-range PVM, like a M2 MDU? This may actually be my favorite tier of PVM over the highest end, if I'm being honest, and I think here too the difference can be really clear to see. Areas of high detail can have more contrast on the modded system, in part I assume just by virtue of not being discolored by adjacent pixels. But of course, I love the texture of consumer CRTs too, and here, well, it's here that the difference between unmodified and modded consoles is the least apparent. It's easy enough to tell which is which, especially if you look at Pocky's hair, but only because they're displayed side by side, and neither is all that different from the other. Hopefully, I've tested enough scenarios for you to get an idea as to whether this mod is beneficial for you in the way that you'd like to use your SNES. If you only play on a consumer-grade CRT, then the benefits are kinda thin on the ground. And if you need composite and S-video, then it's a no-go, at least for now. But if you play on a PVM or through an upscaler, especially if you capture and stream video, then I think the benefits are pretty obvious. It just depends on what you're ultimately trying to do with the signal and your own personal taste. If you really want to use optimized sampling through any upscaler, then it's an absolute must. But one-chip consoles with cleaned up output via RGB mods and the C11 capacitor replacement technically still provide a better image compared to a modded two-chip console, although almost imperceptibly so. The benefits to two chips over one chips mostly revolve around being more technically authentic and of course being far more commonly available. Let me put it this way. If I'd had the new mods installed in my original personal SNES console, I'm pretty sure I would set it up as my primary system in lieu of the modded one-chip Junior, just because of that accuracy factor, even though it matters in vanishingly few scenarios. But since it is really easy to use Japanese carts on American systems, but not vice versa due to the cartridge slot shape, the Junior will probably remain my primary console. I mean, I'd love to use my personal original console more often, but it's the oldest system that I own that I am the original owner of that specific unit. So I'm trying to avoid altering it for as long as I can, even down to keeping that danged sticker there for as long as it'll hold on. So your decision to go two-chip, one-chip, mod, or no mod will similarly rest on a balance of personal factors. I'm an odd case because the types of videos I make necessitates having all of these variants and different mods on hand, so what you choose to do and why will probably be a lot different from what I did, which is getting the mod put into a potentially less long-lived board revision with a less versatile cartridge slot. That decision made sense for me as a reviewer of retro game tech with access to more than one SNES console, plenty of Super Famicom carts, and a Super Famicom Form Factor FX Pack Pro. But that may or may not be what you'd do. Now, I'm working on this video in mid-January 2024, and the mod should be available via Voltar's own installation services soon. Probably late January or early February, I'm told. I'd say the best thing to do is just keep an eye on RetroRGB.com because I'm sure there will be posts announcing availability as soon as it's publicly announced. And by the way, Bob from RetroRGB is working on an overview on SNES video output that includes this mod and some more details on the tech side and may be out by the time you see this video. And Tito from Macho Nacho Productions will be making an installation video, which will be relevant in regard to the DIY kits that will be available later. The initial availability will only be through Voltar's installation services, which, hey, I get it. He's spent a lot of his own time and money getting this mod perfected and produced, so I wish them the best in evading the cloners for as long as possible. You know, come to think of it, I rarely hear people argue in favor of soft video output for SNES in the same way that many consider composite video essential for Sega Genesis, or the differences in opinion regarding N64 blur. Maybe I'm off base here, but I suspect that more people consider it a flaw and not a feature. But no matter what your take on it is, it's always great when people have options for what they can do with their consoles. Well, anyway, that's that. As always, this ended up being a lot longer than I meant for it to be, but you know, that's okay because I have to say, I had a lot of fun making just a good old-fashioned RGB mod video again. Just barely holding on. It's time. It's time.